Hey everyone, this is Kyle with Fruit Tours by Foot. What we're going to do today is we're going to go on a walking tour of the middle part of Central Park. I think that most people, when they visit New York City, they spend most of their time in the lower part of Central Park. It's kind of closer to all the tourist activities down there. And very few people make it up this far on the first few times in New York, but I think you're missing a lot. I think obviously there are a lot of locals that'll be hanging out here, but there's a lot of interesting monuments, there's a lot of interesting scenery, there's a castle. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk around, I'm going to explore this too, I'm going to tell you some history about what's going on. I'm also going to put on the map where I'm going at different points, so if you wanted to do this yourself, you're like, I really want to see that, then you can. Should be pretty easy. If you're not feeling like you want to do any of that, you just want to watch from home, that's an option as well. We begin our walk by entering the park on the 79th Street Traverse. That's where our first stop will be the Swedish Cottage and Shakespeare Garden. Next, we're going to head to the fairytale Belvedere Castle for some wonderful views of the park. So next, we're going to go over to the Great Lawn. After that, we're going to head over to Cleopatra's Needle, which is also called the Central Park obelisk. And after all of that, we're going to go through the Ramble, which is Central Park's wild side, where we're going to exit out through the beautiful Bethesda Terrace. And finally, we're going to be ending the tour at Strawberry Fields, which is a living memorial for John Lennon. But first thing you're going to do when you get started is you're going to go to the Natural History Museum. Because if you have not been to the Natural History Museum, then you're kind of missing out, right? So right behind me right here, it's the Natural History Museum. I know go in the dark a little bit when that happens. The Natural History Museum is the largest natural history museum in the world. It has over 33,000 different specimens from all around the world. And it also has this incredible art there as well. So it's worth going to if you've never been there. It's a New York institution. I've talked enough about it, but just make sure you do go. And after that, you actually just walk across the street because that's where that entrance is. You're just going to start walking. Now, when we're walking around, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you some history about New York City. I'm going to be telling you some history about the park and why it got created, because I think people don't usually expect how interesting and unique this is, right? First thing that you really got to know when you're walking around Central Park, I'm going to just tell you a little bit of a history about it, is that everything you see when you walk around Central Park, it's really natural for people to just assume that it was pretty much like this, and they maybe just slap some pavement down, and that was it. Just put some pavement down, that's it. When people look and they see just a scene like this, it's really natural to be like, oh, well, what did they really do, actually? But the thing that I really need to emphasize to you all is that all of it, everything, was brought in. So, the trees back there, those trees were all individually planted as saplings originally. The dirt was all brought in. In fact, they brought over 4 feet of dirt to cover the entire area. Really, by the way, all that dirt is actually from New Jersey, so don't tell New Yorkers our favorite park is actually from New Jersey. But really what you're looking around, you're seeing, people don't realize the amount of effort that went into this. So we're going to kind of go into why did they even build this? What was the point of this all? But you may have naturally then just wondered, okay, so you're telling me that literally everything was brought in, but there must have been something there beforehand. And that's pretty accurate, that's true. There was something here beforehand. I'm going to just kind of walk over here to show you kind of a good view of what you would have seen beforehand, right? And so you can see this big rock. This is schist, not the bad word, schist. And this would have just been a big rocky outcropping, just tons of big rocks, kind of like this. And then when they built this park, they used dynamite and they used gunpowder. So they used more gunpowder to build this park than was used in our entire Battle of Gettysburg and our Civil War. So that's just the kind of basics when you're walking around. Very New York. You get the sirens, even in the park. So that's just the basics to know when you're walking around. The next question that you naturally all have is well, why did they do all that effort? Why did they blow up so many rocks just to create a park? To fully understand this, we actually need to travel back in time to the early 1800s. So New York City had this incredible population growth. Our population went from about 200,000 people in the 1820s to about 1 million people in the 1850s. Over the course of 30 years, we experienced over 400% growth. Why did that happen, you may be asking, is a really good question. The big answer for that is because of the Erie Canal. There was this new pathway that if people wanted to get to the interior of the country, New York City suddenly became the best option. But with all of this tremendous traffic and people coming here, industry coming here, then people were suddenly faced with this huge scrunch and they had nowhere to go. They're all hanging out mostly in lower Manhattan at this point in the 1850s. They're like bumping right up against their neighbors, have nowhere to go. So if you wanted to get away to do anything, what you would do is you'd hang out in a cemetery. I know that sounds weird. I'm going to show you some photos. But like you see like a woman hanging out just reading in a cemetery and you're like, oh, who is this crazy goth kid? Like, what is she doing there? By the way, whenever you're in New York City, you always look across the street, even in the park, because you got crazy bikers going all over the place. Anyway, so you're hanging out in cemeteries. This is all the people were doing. And there was no real parks to speak of. So New York City basically says like, okay guys, like stop hanging out in cemeteries. We're gonna build you a giant park. We're gonna take up the whole center part of Manhattan Island. We're really bad at naming things. We're just gonna call it Central Park. Now, the big thing that people don't really realize when they're walking around seeing Central Park is they don't realize that like different parts of this park are supposed to give you different like emotions, essentially. As the kids would say now, like different vibes, different energies. I sometimes like reference it as like scenes of a movie, because they're obviously not trying to film movies here in the 1860s. But what they were really thinking about at this time was like trying to evoke different scenes or tableaus. But this is exactly what I'm talking about. Because there was a World's Fair in the 1870s. There was a big, huge, this was the contribution from Sweden. And so Sweden puts this up, Frederick Law Olmsted sees it, he buys it, reinstalls it here, and he says, that, you know what, that's perfect for the Swedish cottage scene. So what this is going for right here is like stumbling across a cottage in Sweden. Now this was like a movie set in that this was not supposed to have anyone inside. There was nothing that was supposed to be inside there, just an empty set that you'd walk across and be like, ooh, interesting. It wasn't like Swedish school children would pour out and then you'd be like, oh, it's like we're in Sweden. So that's what you're supposed to really recognize when you're walking through Central Park, is that there's different like scenes and different parts are supposed to feel different ways. So where we're going to be walking up through at this next section, so that's kind of like your quick little point. You see this Swedish cottage, put that on the map, you got that. Then what you do right next to it is this kind of cool little staircase right here. And you're going to just go up that staircase because this is going to bring you to what's called a Shakespeare's Garden. Shakespeare's Garden, this was originally just a rock garden. It was a British rock garden. One day they decided to like change that all around and make it into a Shakespeare Garden. So what you see when you look in the Shakespeare Garden is different flowers and plants. And then you have different sort of like, they're all supposed to be referenced by different Shakespeare plays. So there's all these little plaques that are hidden within here. So, you know, after you leave all that, you're gonna be going up a hill. This is the biggest climb that you're going to have the whole tour. That's because where we're going to be walking to is the castle at the top of the hill, and this castle is called Belvedere Castle. So what you see when you're at Belvedere Castle, so now you're up here, you're at Belvedere Castle. Now I know that what you're thinking is that this castle doesn't look very big. Originally this was supposed to be a big, huge, sprawling, like massive British castle-like thing that you'd find, but then they ran out of money. So they made it a lot smaller. If you've kind of noticed ever before that this maybe looks a little familiar, if any of you watched Sesame Street, then this is where the Count lives. If any of you saw the Smurfs, you know, the blue creatures, then Gargamel's castle was based off of this as well. Now the main thing that you got to know about this is the highest point of Central Park. Right up there at the top, way up there, that's the highest point. So if you ever type in like the weather map and you say like, what's the weather in Central Park right now? You're getting the weather for like that point right up there. Again, this was not supposed to be anything originally. All this was a castle. You're supposed to look at it and be like, ooh, pretty, and then walk away. There wasn't like the royal family of Central Park that was going here or anything like that. But when you're in here, you can like, and there's a lot of weddings that will be going on here sometimes too. Maybe it's a little hard to see, but there's actually what's called a Shakespeare Theater behind there. It's the Delacourt Theater, and the Shakespeare Theater is where they do all of the Shakespeare in the Park plays. Now, you've probably heard of Shakespeare being performed in parks. The concept of Shakespeare being performed in parks is obviously not unique to New York, but the branding Shakespeare in the Park is unique to New York. And when you got to know about that is that originally there was a guy named Joseph Papp. He was doing this Shakespeare festival, and he was just performing Shakespeare plays. People really liked it. They started coming out. They started hanging out to see him. And it got bigger and bigger and bigger, all the way to the point that the city got really frustrated by there were so many people there. They started saying like, oh, we're going to start needing to charge you taxes. We're going to need to charge you for any problems with the grass. So essentially what happened was Joseph Papp and some other people talked to some wealthy benefactors, including a guy named George Delacourt. They put that money together and they said, okay, we're going to build a theater. And so that's what the end result was. That Shakespeare Theater does still do free Shakespeare plays. Currently, at this year right now, 2021, in the summer, they are doing Shakespeare plays right now. They did not do them last year. But the Shakespeare plays will usually be kind of like truncated or shorter. Sometimes they have really famous people. In fact, the very first Shakespeare play that they did there was A Merchant of Venice at George C. Scott, and it also had James Earl Jones in the 60s. So this was like pre-Star Wars days. So what you're going to walk around and you're going to see right over here is this like kind of interesting bench when you do that. And I know that you're just like, okay, so that's just a bench. I'm going to try and zoom in a little bit right here. There's this guy right there. His name's Charles Stover. That might be backwards. Who knows? This bench is a lot more important than people realize because Charles Stover completely changed the whole nature of the park. The thing you got to know about Central Park is when they originally designed this, this was all about rules and structure. New Yorkers like rules, surprising, right? It's all about rules and structure. In fact, there was a newspaper article that published like all of the rules of Central Park beforehand, and you were kind of expected to kind of know these. They said all these sorts of things. They said like, don't run in the park, don't yell in the park, there are no games of chance, no screaming, no yelling right there. All of those things were really important to New Yorkers with this park. They had people kind of enforcing it. It was really strict. Then this guy comes along, his name Charles Stover. He gets this cool bench dedicated to him right here. The reason why he gets the bench, and it's again hard to see, but it says, if you were to really look there, it says founder of outdoor playgrounds. A lot of people are like, did outdoor playgrounds need to be founded? Is that a thing that needed to happen? What he did is he said, guys, I got this crazy idea. Because before, there were all these rules, very like quiet, very structured. The whole point of it was you were supposed to walk through and just like be quiet and look around and be like, ooh, interesting. Children were allowed in the park, but everything that a child does was not allowed in the park. Charles Stover comes in and he says, like, guys, I got a new idea. This is going to be crazy, but I think children can play in the park. And everybody was like, no, that's crazy. That's insane. He built a playground, and this was so controversial that he actually got ousted from office. So because of all of that, this actually became a totally different view of the park because he builds that playground. It's the most popular thing. Everybody loves the playground. They think it's amazing. And this completely changed the nature of the park. They're like, you know what, maybe kids can play in the park. Maybe this isn't just like a quiet space where nobody can do anything. And so because of that, he gets that really kind of crazy bench right there. In fact, it's also an echo spot. So if you were to like talk into one end of it, then it would like, the echoes would bounce around all the way to the other side. What you're gonna kind of see when you like exit this area, it's kind of this back little area. It seems really unremarkable to most people, but that's what would have been the location for an entire town called Seneca Village. Seneca Village is kind of like, it's kind of unfortunately one of those like dirty secrets of Central Park that New York has historically tried to overlook. The quick history that I was talking about before is where Central Park, there's this whole idea where like, we're going to build Central Park just to have people not hang out in cemeteries, and that's true. They were concerned about that. The real reason why they were doing all of this, which we're getting into a little bit more, was all about water. It was about a reservoir system that they wanted to build. So they wanted this kind of like clean, pristine, whole massive area, not surrounded by dirty buildings where they could just have like open water essentially. So they chose the whole center part of the island. Now here's where this all gets really problematic, is that when they chose this, there were already people that were living here. It's called Seneca Village. Seneca Village, unfortunately, was a population mostly of former slaves that were freed in 1819, and they went up and created Seneca Village. Several hundred people, 10% of the black voting bloc for all of New York City was in Seneca Village. And New York City says, I'm sorry, we're going to use this for a park. They paid them some money in eminent domain, but not very much money. And they said, you all have to leave. Where this gets really problematic is that the classification that New York said afterwards was essentially that this was a shanty town, this was an illegal settlement, like who really cares about them anyway, because they didn't technically own the land. But we do know that they owned the land, because at that time, if you were a voting member of the population, you had to be male, and you also had to own land. So we know that they legally owned the land. This was an incorporated place. This had a church, it had a cemetery, it had markets. So New York City got rid of them, and it is kind of important to acknowledge some of that earlier history, because that doesn't mean that you can't enjoy Central Park, but it is important to acknowledge because it wasn't until the 1990s that researchers were going in trying to figure out like what exactly was this population. They realized just how bad it was, just like what exactly New York City did to like forcibly move this population of people. So there's not really very much around of that area anymore. There's just like one remnant essentially. So again, it's just important to acknowledge some of that early history. Yeah, so it's like a big patch of grass. And you're like, what's so interesting about that? Like, why are you standing in a patch of grass? But what's really important is about the Great Lawn, this is what this is called, is originally it was part of that reservoir. When I talked a little bit ago where I said that really the whole reason why they built this park was all about water, this was part of that reservoir. So there are these two kind of square points. And when you see on like the original map, then you'll see like there's a big spot up there that's going to be the Jackie Onassis Reservoir is what it's called now. This section was part of that. It was two squares. Now that reservoir is pretty much never really was adequately taken advantage of. So they got rid of those squares. They filled in this area using dirt from when they built Rockefeller Center. So what you're going to do from there is you're going to walk down some of these windy paths. Something that people sometimes don't realize about Central Park is that there's really only very few straight walking paths. And so most of the time you're walking on these kind of curved things, like right here. Sometimes they bring you away from your next destination like they are for us right now, but it's fine. And when you turn around, you're going to be heading to one of two very strange, basically makes no sense monuments. And we're going to be talking about those. All right. And so where you're going to see right here, we're going to walk up to this in just a second, but I want to kind of get like a bigger, taller view. There's like a big, huge Egyptian obelisk. And that's where you're going to be walking next. You're going to walk down that kind of twisty-turny path. And then this obelisk is very strange to people. This is actually, in my opinion, probably the strangest part of the entire Central Park experience. It's very tall, very big. Let's see if we can pan up right there. Oh, what is going on with this? A lot of people don't realize that this is actually a real Egyptian obelisk. The thing that you got to really understand about this obelisk is that it is real. And you may be then saying, like, what is an obelisk? What's an ancient Egyptian obelisk doing in Central Park? In the 1800s, the world was obsessed with ancient Egypt. There was what was called Egyptomania. And the reason for that was the Egyptian empire was so big and lasted so long that all of these world governments and powerful people said, how did they do it? How did they last for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years? There must be something unique, powerful, maybe mystical about what they're doing. So people started thinking about these artifacts in this mystic way. Even at the point that, like, so London got an ancient Egyptian obelisk. You can still see it, it's right by the Thames. And everyone was like freaking out, being like, this mystical power will be drawn upon London, and it too may last for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years. So they get an obelisk, everyone's freaking out. Paris gets an obelisk, everyone's freaking out. New York City's like, how will we ever be a long-lasting city for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years if we don't have an ancient Egyptian obelisk? So they arrange a deal, they pay for it, and they ship it over. Now, they shipped this over in the 1880s. I'm going to show another view of it right there. What you see right here is 200 tons in just the obelisk. This base, that is 50 tons. They're moving all of this from ancient Egypt in the 1800s. So what they did first is they put it down on the ground. They like use these leather straps to like lower it on the ground. They get it onto a bunch of cannonballs and they start to like push it. And they feed the cannonballs from the back to the front as their system, and they just push it, right? Believe it or not, that was a much better system than what the Americans tried when it got here. But They lifted it up using like leather straps and a crane. They put it into a boat, but guess what? The boat was too small. So they literally cut a hole in the side of the boat so it was pointing out the side. And it starts floating over, using their motor. They're floating over, right? They get to about 100 miles off the coast of New York City, and then the motor breaks. So they have to be pulled and dragged all the way the rest of the way. They bring it off the boat, and they literally tie it to horses, 40 horses. They drag it along the ground. And when they drag it along the ground, you know, obviously there's damage to it, and they go, you know what, these horses are getting tired, let's not do that. Instead, we're gonna build a train to push it. Naturally, what you would do. So they build a tiny toy train, essentially, where they, like, again, just have this track that's flexible that they move from the back to the front, and they push it. And when they finally get it here in 1881, this was the biggest deal ever. Everyone was freaking out about it. They loved it. They thought it was amazing. They put it upright. The whole city's here. And almost as soon as they put it upright, everyone promptly forgot about it. And now most people don't even know that we have this happen. And it was like this bizarre incident that happened in the 1880s. There's a lot of questions of whether we should still have it. There's some questions about whether it should be outside in the elements, if this is an artifact from the ancient world. All of those are totally fair. As of right now, those are just questions. There's no movement on any of that. Okay, now let's see if I can get a view of this. It might be a little hard to see right there. We'll kind of walk around it. But this guy right here, this monument is to Poland, specifically a Polish leader. And I'm going to be honest, when I do these tours, I usually ask if someone speaks Polish on my tour, because I've tried very, very hard to say this man's name correctly, and I cannot. I try, anytime there's someone from Poland on my tour, we like workshop it together, and I try and say it, and they're like, it's not that. So I'm going to try right now, but I'm going to warn you, what I'm going to say is not how it's pronounced. But his name was Władysław Jagiello.
Jogaila.
Not how it's pronounced. He was a ruler of Poland in the 1400s. He was really famous for uniting different factions of Poland. So you naturally then may be asking, like, why on earth do we have a statue for this crazy guy from Poland? Like, what exactly is going on with this guy right here? Again, it's a good question. The best, again, easy answer is that there was a World's Fair in New York City in the 1930s, and this was the contribution from Poland. Poland had another statue like this originally. It was a lot bigger. Same guy, Władysław Jagiello, not pronounced like that. And it was really big. This was like a replica of that. This was their contribution for the World's Fair in the 1930s. Then, as you may know from history, the Nazis invaded into Poland, and the World's Fair ended. But what happened was the Nazis, the original statue, they melted it down, they destroyed it, they melted it down, they used it for bullets. Because of this, then New York City was really hesitant to give them this statue, because they're like, well, it's probably just going to do the same thing, we're just giving them more bullets. So instead, they just held on to it. It was not in Central Park at this point. That's really important that you understand, right? Not in Central Park. All this was just hanging out in New York City. It was just sitting there. And then, decades later, we had a mayor whose name was LaGuardia. You've probably heard of the airport, same guy. Mayor LaGuardia is running for re-election, and he was very concerned about the Polish vote. And so because he was so concerned about the Polish vote, he says, you know what I can do to make sure that all of the Polish vote will turn out for me is that I will do a big, huge show of how much I love the Polish people of New York City. And to do that, I'm going to take that statue at its other location and move it to a centralized part of Central Park. So that's why we have this here at this centralized part of a Polish ruler from the 1400s that really has nothing to do with New York City whatsoever. But it's all socio-political geopolitics going on right there. Now this pond, I'm going to be totally blunt, is the most creatively named body of water in all of Central Park. Now are you ready for it? It's literally just called Turtle Pond. It's called Turtle Pond because there are turtles there. I don't know if you've noticed, like a whole theme of New York is that we're very literal people. We say there are turtles in Turtle Pond, so we're going to just call it Turtle Pond. If you're like, well, why is that so creatively named compared to the others? Well, the other ones are called the lake or the pond. Or there's another one that seems really creative when you see it at first, except when you learn it's literally just the Dutch word for water. So Turtle Pond actually is the most creative of all of those. It's cool if you go hang out down there, show some like video. You can see there are turtles there. I had a kid once on my tour who was obsessed with turtles, and like we could not tear him away from this particular spot. We were like, we might just need to do the rest of the tour here. He started crying whenever we left. Tried to get a turtle to take back with us on the tour. So it's kind of cool. See some wildlife, see some turtles, go hang out at Turtle Pond. Well, where are you going to go up next? We're going to be going into the woods next. This is this is the original part of Central Park, the first part of Central Park where we're going to be going up next. So when you follow that path, you're going to take a left right afterwards, and you're going to start walking into some really well overgrown, covered area, right? So you're going to walk into this. This is going to be called the Ramble, what you're going to be walking into. The Ramble is the densest tree cover of the entire park. This is the original part of the park that they first built. This is the oldest section of the park. This was the whole vibe they're going for when we were talking about like that from before, is that they're going for like deep within the woods. That's the kind of energy that they're trying to do here. You'll see that when you walk around immediately. Obviously, they did not plan for big, huge, tall buildings around Central Park, but that's actually one of my favorite parts about the Ramble, is you start walking in the Ramble, you can't see any of that, right? You start walking around, you could just be in upstate New York at this point. You could be just like walking on a trail almost anywhere. You may find though, when you come through the Ramble, that it is kind of like hard to navigate sometimes. Like you're going to be walking around sometimes and like not totally know exactly where you are. I know in the age of smartphones, the easy answer is to just whip out your phone and all of the paths are charted. But back in the day, if you did not have this, what you would do is you'd look at this on this, the lamppost, right? You'll see that code right there. These codes, they were telling you everything you needed to know to get around. So 778 tells you everything that you need to know. What that tells me right now is that I'm closest to 77th Street. And the last digit, if it's even, I'm closer to the east side of the park. If it's odd, I'm closer to the west side of the park. It's that easy. So if you're ever, like as they'll sometimes say, you're like in the Ramble for some bizarre reason, your phone dies and you have a very important meeting and you get lost, then that's what you can use. Many systems of redundancy here. But what you're going to do here, this is where you're going to be taking a left at this point. And then you're going to take the immediate right afterwards. The real thing that I'm kind of bringing us to as we go down this way is just again re-emphasizing how everything part of this park is very manicured, very planned. When you think of like those Dutch roots, like it starts to make sense a little bit, where you say like, oh, New York came from the Dutch. The New Yorkers really like to manage this. What do the Dutch like to do? Same old thing. And so what you're going to do when you come down this way is you're going to, and maybe you can kind of hear it already, but there's a nice, cute little bubbling brook, which is just kind of this like cute little scene. I'm going to show you this right over here. Oh yeah, again, really nice, tiny little miniature little waterfall rapids going on right here. It's very tempting to say like, oh, that's so naturalistic and beautiful. Now this is all real, but that's New York City drinking water right there. That's what it is. Same thing that you get out of the tap. This is not, you're not drinking this water, right? It goes through the whole system. But it's important to realize then you're walking around and be like, oh, that's just New York City drinking water. This was all created. Literally same thing from the pipes gets shot into there, it cycles through the whole system. Same thing. That's part of the magic though of Central Park, I think though, is that when you walk around, it's so easy to forget. So many people walk around, and on my tours, I'll just keep reminding people, I'm like saying like, guys, I know you're gonna keep forgetting this because it doesn't feel this way. But every few stops, I'll just say, remember, this was created. And that's one of those moments where you can look at it and be like, this does not feel created, but it is. What you're gonna do, you're gonna go straight across. And when you do this in the Ramble, you're gonna be at this kind of bird watching station. There will be a bunch of bird feeders. If you come here during the high like migration times, you're gonna find a lot of bird watchers here. And it's a really hopping spot. There's not so many right now, and the bird feeders are all mostly empty because this isn't really the time to see like really interesting migratory pattern birds. There will be other birds that people will see here. We had a kind of a famous like snowy owl that was seen just the last winter, which is really rare. You don't see that. There was a barred owl that was here. Her name was Barry, excuse me. Unfortunately passed away not too long ago. But a lot of people, when they go on my tours, this is actually their favorite part of the whole tour. They walk through, it's so quiet, it's so nice. Spend some time in the Ramble, just chill out, get away from all of this. You don't need to hang out in a cemetery anymore, just hang out in the Ramble. So where you're gonna find yourself at this point is you're gonna be right by what's called, as I said before, the lake. Really creatively named. Now you may be wanting to do that romantic paddling of boats that you see so many times in movies, and if you do want to do that, you're right by where you do that. You actually go just over there, right by the Low Boathouse, and that's where you're gonna like pay the money to grab the boat and just like paddle around for a little bit. Low Boathouse is a high-end restaurant at this point. I had a woman on my tour once who said that she got a cheeseburger there for $35. She said, then I got an ice cream scoop for $8. So if those are the prices you're looking for, then you can go to the Low Boathouse. It is, good food, so I've heard. But you're gonna follow up this path. Now, what you will find as you're walking up over here is you're getting into probably the most famous part of the entire park. So there's definitely gonna be a lot more crowds at this point. And it's kind of interesting because literally just across the lake, we're in the Ramble where we hardly saw anyone. Now you're gonna start seeing more people. We're here like a little bit earlier on like a Tuesday. So it's not quite as popular, but if you come here on a weekend, prime time, this is going to be really crowded. But you'll notice is Bethesda Fountain, Bethesda Terrace, okay? Bethesda Fountain and Bethesda Terrace is really famous. Everybody knows it. It's in the center part. It kind of connects like the middle part where we've been to the lower part. So at the end of the tour, if you like wanted to go back down the lower part, you could just take that, hang out by the lower section of the park. Bethesda Fountain and Terrace was the only part of the park that was completed during our Civil War. It was the only part of the park that was completed without without Calvert Vaux or Frederick Law Olmsted. That's because they were briefly fired off of the project. This was part of their original design, so it was part of their design, but then the city is basically like, you're taking too long, we're gonna fire you. They fire them. The city took way longer to do this than they did, so they hired him back right afterwards. But what's really cool about this, and probably one of the most important things that you should know, is that this fountain that we're going to spend some time with, the whole point of this fountain, the whole point was this is all about water, all right? This is all about pure, obviously, I know you're like, fountains about water, no way. But this particular one was like advertising the purity of New York water. That was the original design idea behind it. It's supposed to be like, our water is so pure, it's so clean, because you remember, the whole point of this park was really about the reservoirs originally. So that's why it was there. Now this was contracted. The first time a woman in New York City got a public commission to do any artwork whatsoever was this. Her name was Emma Stebbins. What makes Emma Stebbins really notable was that in the mid-1800s she was openly gay, which you wouldn't see very often. But her dad was extremely wealthy, so essentially everybody just looked the other way. But she did not make many pieces in New York, just a few. This is without a doubt her most famous. It's very beautiful, it's incredible. And again, it's kind of like the centerpiece for all of Central Park right over here. Another kind of cool little thing, if you're just looking for cool street musicians, and like buskers, that whole scene, like within there, the acoustics are incredible. You'll get like professional opera singers sometimes, professional musicians, string musicians, they'll hang out in there. So I highly recommend that as well. In fact, what am I thinking? We're gonna just go over there and hang out ourselves. When you're going to make this bend, one thing that you will not see right now, but it is important to notice, these trees, if you happen to be here during the cherry blossom season, this is your spot to go, right? You're going to see amazing cherry blossoms. These are all cherry blossoms, but it's not the right season for it right now. So you're not going to see it as very impressive at this current moment, but if you plan your trip correctly, you're going to have incredible photos, but you're also going to need to fight with a lot of people taking wedding photos, because that's also where everybody seems to take their wedding photo. But what you're gonna do is like emerge through these. There's a big fountain in the middle of like a dirt patch. It's called Cherry Hill, and the reason why it's important is that in the early stages of the park, after that's completed in the 1870s, surprisingly, it wasn't super popular. Now, people did start coming here, but a lot of the trees that you see around when you walk around Central Park were still saplings. Like I told you, they planted them. They built this park with later generations in mind. They were not building it for them, they were building it for us, right? So when they did it, if you were to walk around the park at that time, it'd be kind of unimpressive. There weren't people living around here in the 1870s. There was no subway line that would bring you here. So it was a really big haul to get up here to see unimpressive trees. The reason why this is important is because this was like essentially a horse trough. That's all it really was. But this was really big for carriages. The wealthy would have these big fancy carriages that they would bring up with them. And all of the kind of commoners, I don't know what else to say, the proletariat, would be hanging out watching this, seeing their big fancy carriages, and they started like gathering into crowds. From this then turned into carriage shows of Central Park. And the carriage shows of Central Park were really the first events of Central Park after it opens. People would come up here to see these big, fancy, expensive carriages. And it all kind of grew out of this experience of just like horses drinking at the horse trough at this very fancy, not Friends Fountain horse trough, right? So that's why this location is kind of notable at this time. At this point, it's really just like a, landmark for us. As we kind of wind up the tour, we just got like really one more stop that we're going to be making, and then we'll be right by Central Park West. But just it's important to remember some of that earlier history. But we're going to do just kind of one more stop, and it's kind of a notable stop. And we're going to what's called Strawberry Fields. The reason why we're going to Strawberry Fields is it's right outside the Dakota, which I mentioned earlier. And why it's important that it's outside the Dakota is because unfortunately that's where John Lennon was assassinated. Now, I hope I don't have to explain who John Lennon is to people. But why this is notable, you can maybe even hear in the background a little bit right there. John Lennon was assassinated just outside the Dakota. He lived there with his wife, Yoko Ono. It was 1980 in December, and John Lennon was leaving to do a radio interview. When he leaves to do this radio interview, then there's a man outside named Mark David Chapman. Mark David Chapman tries to get him to sign some records. And when he does this, what always kind of like affects me is that John Lennon clearly, I feel like, could see something was off about this guy. And he asked Mark David Chapman, his future assassin, he doesn't know this at the time, but he says, "Hey, are you okay? You feel like you're maybe like need some help. Is there anything I can do to help you?" Mark David Chapman shakes his head. He says, "No, I'm fine. John Lennon just like walks away. He gets in a car, does a radio interview. When he comes back, Mark David Chapman is still there. And unfortunately, he assassinates him. He shoots him 4 times. He's dead almost instantly. Now, and the aftermath, and why this is notable for this location, is that Yoko Ono was given permission to redesign part of the park. So she has this section to redesign. And she said that John Lennon and her talked about how there are already a lot of statues in Central Park. So he wouldn't have wanted like another statue of Central Park. So what they opted for was what she opted for was a living memorial, right? So that's why this is called Strawberry Fields. And Strawberry Fields actually is a really great place. At the end of all of this that I've like pushed you and you like walked all around, you can sit down in this space right over here, which I'm going to show you. And this space has like usually buskers, maybe you can kind of hear it in the background right now. They're playing oftentimes John Lennon songs. There's this cool mosaic on the ground which says Imagine. And it's a great place to just end off the tour. Right after that, you're going to be right by the same subway line that we started off by. It's the B and the C line. You're just one stop down on 72nd Street. So it's an easy, just U-shape that we took right here. And I hope that you've enjoyed hanging out while we've been around Central Park. It's really been a lot of fun, walking around showing you guys virtually. And please, take the tours. All of the information I've given, much more is covered on the tours as well. So it's worth taking the tours even after we've spent this time together, right? So I hope you've enjoyed, and I'll see you at the next one.